Football Never Sleeps, our off-season YouTube show focusing on Notre Dame football. And this week, the life story of Sam Hartman, or at least his media debut with Andy Media. We're weekly during the off-season. This is like Monday Night Live, our in-season show, except we do it on different days of the week, kind of driven by the news cycle. So we're on a Thursday night this week. We appreciate you joining us. Got lots to talk about with the coaching carousel, still spitting out some new names, getting to know some of these new coaches. We had the NFL Combine, player interviews last night, got to know a lot of the newcomers. And of course, we take your questions. And so you need to start filling up the question portal, and we'll kind of work those in as we go through the different topics tonight.
Yeah, and a quick refresher for anyone who needs a lesson on how to submit the questions. If you are on a desktop or on the YouTube website, there should be a comment section to the right-hand side where you can submit a question. Or if you're on a mobile app or of some sort, you can submit that to the bottom of the screen. So hopefully you can figure that out. If you can't, maybe wave your hands and maybe we'll be able to see you. I'm not sure, but try to find maybe someone that is more YouTube literate than even us at times. But Eric, I know that we have a lot to discuss, so I won't blabber too much. But I just want to say,
we'll blabber about one more thing. Because we're irregular during this time of year, make sure you hit the subscribe button and that notification bell. Tyler's already got queued up with a little finger on it. And that way you'll know whenever we have new content. And we've got content beyond this show. Tyler had some interviews from last night, including Sam Hartman, so you don't want to miss those.
Yeah, so the Sam Hartman video should be posted, and I'll have some more videos coming to the channel as we go throughout the week. But we appreciate everyone tuning in live, submitting questions live, and also those of you who catch us on replay. You are appreciated as well. So, Eric, what do you want to discuss first in terms of your quick takes from the latest news and notes from Notre Dame football?
I wanted to start with Sam Hartman, but I think we'll save him for a little bit, and we'll start with the coaching carousel just because there's been so much with that. We got introduced to a couple of the new coaches last night. But let's start with Brian Mason leaving his special teams coordinator job after 1 year for a job with the Indianapolis Colts. Tyler, why do you think that was an attractive option for Brian? Obviously, he had a great working relationship with Marcus, but what made the Indianapolis Colts job something he couldn't turn down?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the NFL for one. You get to coach at the highest level, and he's from the Indianapolis area. He has family there. He has a young family of his own. So I think it's kind of a no-brainer. It's hard to imagine much of a better fit for him personally than to coach special teams at the NFL level near his hometown. And I think that was a very attractive option for him. And I know some people felt like, and I think mostly informed by the fact that so many other coaches have left, that there was like this was some sort of betrayal to Marcus Freeman and their friendship. And I don't see it that way at all.
No.
I think if Brian Mason ever wanted to come back to the college level and work with Marcus Freeman again, I imagine Marcus Freeman would do that in the drop of a hat.
Exactly. And again, we have a narrative out there still that because of the whole buyout thing and misunderstanding about how that played out, there's a thought that Notre Dame isn't paying these guys. Notre Dame is paying these guys. This wasn't an economic decision for Brian Mason. This was the dream job, family, long-term, and coaches move around. And so Brian Mason chose this. So who comes in for Brian Mason? Why, it's Marty Biagi. Marty has been at Notre Dame before. He was here in 2016 as a special teams analyst. So he helped the special teams coach and provided him numbers and film and things of that nature. And then Marty has been at several different places since then, including North Texas, where he was super successful. And then at Purdue and Ole Miss, where the numbers don't jump out at you. In fact, they jump out at you in maybe a negative way. So let's go through the assets and concerns with Marty Biagi. First of all, Tyler, what do you like about the Marty Biagi hiring? And it was confirmed today he'll be the next coach. You'll get the official announcement probably next week.
Yeah, I think to me the most important thing, well, I guess probably two things. But the most important thing to me is that he's respected in the profession. He's been a 2-time finalist for the Football Scoop Special Teams Coordinator of the Year, and that is voted on by guys who have won the award and that are in the profession. So if he has the respect of other coaches in the industry, he must be doing something right. Secondly, just his special teams experience as a player, the fact that he was a punter and a kicker in his own right, that is sometimes and probably even many times a weakness for special teams coordinators, that they're not necessarily doing a lot of teaching there. They're relying on some outside sources to help with that, and then just sort of maintaining what is being taught to the punter and kicker from outside. So I think that his knowledge base and experience there should be valuable, and I think he's being put in a position where Brian Mason just in 1 year really sort of cultivated a competitive culture around special teams, not just with getting starters to contribute to special teams, but to bring in walk-ons, to bring in transfers, to sort of push the guys that are in those specialist roles, which sometimes can sort of be unrun against. Like you sort of, well, I'm the long snapper. They put me on scholarship, so I'm going to be doing that for the next 4 years until they sign another scholarship guy. That's not how Brian Mason treated it. We'll see how Marty Biagi handles that, but I would think that Notre Dame has set a blueprint that makes sense there. Marcus Freeman is clearly in favor of that. So I think those are things that I think are attractive about this match between Marty Biagi and Notre Dame. What do you like about it, Eric?
Yeah, I like that Marty has some elite traits in his background. And, I think the one that everybody kind of gravitates to is on YouTube. If you type in Arkansas, North Texas 2018, they had a really funny, I guess you call it a fake fair catch, but the guy never puts his hands up. He just catches the ball, stops, and then the Arkansas guys start walking off the field, and then he just takes off and goes 90 yards for a touchdown. But I like the punt blocks in his background. At North Texas, they had a lot of punt blocks. If you talk to Seth Luttrell, who was the North Texas coach up until the end of this past season, he is effusive in his praise for Marty. And I think it's a big reason why Marty hasn't had trouble moving up the ladder, going to Purdue and then to Ole Miss. The concerns are the numbers at Ole Miss and Purdue that are way down in terms of, there's an FEI index where they grade all kind of aspects of special teams. And Ole Miss wasn't very good this past year, although again, they're going through special teams coaches every year. His successor will be their fourth in 4 years under Lane Kiffin. And then at Purdue, they weren't very good either. Now, again, a lot of your success as a special teams coach, and Tyler touched on this a little bit, has to do with how much of the roster do you have the run of? Do you have the culture? And with Brian Mason and Marcus Freeman in place, I think you'll see the best of Marty Biagi, whatever that's going to look like. You can't dismiss those numbers, but I think you need to look at it in terms of, okay, in the total picture of interviewing him and his potential and so forth. I can point to a couple examples. Harry Hiestand twice,
right?
When he was at Tennessee before coming to Notre Dame, I mean, the Tennessee fans were like, "Fine, take him," and their numbers were very similar for offensive line play to what Biagi's was in special teams. The other example is Marcus Freeman himself going from Purdue to Cincinnati. They won single-digit games during Marcus Freeman's time at Purdue, and that was reflected offensively, defensively, special teams. And so you could say, well, how good is this guy going to be at Cincinnati coordinating the defense when his defense is – so you got to kind of look past the numbers sometimes, or at least the most recent numbers. And I think this is an area where Notre Dame is actually taking a good risk with Marty, especially as Tyler mentioned, the respect he has from the coaching business.
Yeah, those FEI ratings are valuable and notable, but I mean, if I'm being honest, I hadn't paid attention to them until Brian Mason sort of waved them in our face and say, "Hey, this is what we're using to measure ourselves.
Right.
We think I think these are valuable, and this is why what we're doing is different than what Notre Dame has done in the past, using these ratings and to sort of quantify or qualify what the work that was being done for Notre Dame special teams." So to put so much weight into it and say, well, look at these ratings that Marty Biagi had the last 3 seasons, I feel like that's a bit of an overreaction and doesn't necessarily totally capture the ability of a coach to impact a team as a special teams coach, or even for that matter, whatever other rating you want to look at, whether it's offense, defense. So I think coaches can have bad years too. I mean, you can be a really good coach and just not get through for some reason, or not have the talent at your disposal. So I think it's worth noting and knowing. And I don't think it's worth like starting a parade for Marty Biagi. Like, holy cow, how did they manage to get him on campus? But I think there seems to be a lot of potential there that he can tap into. And like we mentioned, how Notre Dame will give him the ability to do that as well.
Right. And so there's 131 teams in the FBS. Ole Miss was 99th. Notre Dame was 6th. And then just to give you another example, Brian Polian down at LSU was 125th. Now, Brian was never like that in either of his stints at Notre Dame. They were much more consistently maybe in the 30s and 40s and maybe a little bit higher than that one year. So, you know, one year doesn't always tell the story, although Brian Kelly didn't reassign Brian Polian after last season. But that just goes to show you a little bit of comparison. Okay, we'll move on to another coaching carousel move. And normally, graduate assistants don't get as much play as James Laurinaitis and now Chris Watt do, but you're getting a higher quality of graduate assistant that really can impact the program. Chris Watt is taking a job with the Indianapolis Colts as an assistant offensive line coach. So it's Tony Sperano is the main offensive line coach. Chris will be assisting just like he did with Harry Hiestand last year at Notre Dame. He was out of grad assistant year, so he was going to have to be an analyst, which at this point, analysts still aren't coaching on the field, and that would have minimized his impact on being able to. Now, it'd been great to have him around, but he wouldn't have been able to be in the day-to-day on-field coaching and practice. I think this is a great move for Chris because I think everybody loves his pedigree and where this is all going with him. I think what people weren't jazzed about in terms of Harry Hiestand's assistant was he's just not experienced enough. And people I respect and kind of the offensive line royalty agreed with me. And I listened to their opinions. They loved Chris Watt. They love what he's going to turn into, but he hasn't turned into that yet. So I think this is a good move for both Notre Dame and for Chris.
Yeah, it's sort of the next step for him in becoming his own offensive line coach, whether it's in the NFL or college. I think it would have been helpful for Notre Dame to help have him still on staff to help bridge the transition from Harry Hiestand to Joe Rudolph, but I doubt he's going to be out of reach. Like, I think if Notre Dame's guys want to reach out to him, I imagine he would be willing to get in touch with them. That's the sort of the upside of guys that are not only former Notre Dame coaches, but are also Notre Dame grads. Like, they want Notre Dame to succeed just as much as anyone. So I would imagine that if someone wants to talk to Chris Watt, that's a current offensive lineman, they'd have that opportunity to do that. And I think, when it comes down to it, the players will have a lot to say in sort of maintaining that standard and carrying the tradition over from Harry Hiestand to Joe Rudolph. And I think that was sort of the same thing that happened when Harry Hiestand left the first time during the Jeff Quinn era. The players took a lot of pride in what was established under Hiestand and carried that over to Quinn. And I would anticipate that the same will sort of happen now moving from Hiestand to Rudolph.
Okay. Tyler, if we have questions that pertain to us, just alert me and we'll jump to those. If not, we'll go
No
on to
no questions yet. But if folks have questions to ask us, feel free to send them in. Our queue is short right now, so you can send them in, and we will try to mix them into our show as we move along.
I see a few of them, but I'm not sure that they're what we're talking about yet. So okay. So the last night was really a great night for the media, although it's kind of all at once. It's like fasting for a few weeks and then having this buffet that makes you want to take a nap. And
it was our Easter dinner.
It was our Easter dinner. So we got to talk to all the offensive newcomers. So that includes Sam Hartman and Caleb Smith, who are grad transfers, and then the early enrolled freshmen, and then a couple of the defensive guys that couldn't come that time. Adon Schuler because he had shoulder surgery, and then Drake Bowen because he had a baseball commitment. Those guys were there. But we're going to turn our attention to the two coaches that were introduced. The first time we got to talk to them, Joe Rudolph and Gino Guiduli. And so Joe coaches offensive line. We'll start with him first, and then Gino coaches quarterbacks. So I know Tyler was talking to Sam Hartman during a lot of the time when the coaches were up there. I know you got a little bit. Do you want to jump in on anything before I go through some of the takeaways on Joe?
I can sort of throw out some things about what I saw, and then have you sort of fill in the gaps, or saw or heard, and have you sort of fill in the gaps. I think one thing that I know that you even mentioned to me after we got done talking was sort of the interesting Harry Hiestand and Joe Moore connections that Joe Rudolph have. Do you want to share with our viewers what those were that you learned?
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if there was any connection with those guys. Joe Rudolph at Wisconsin played for Bill Callahan, who I think is, most people would say, a top 5, if not top 1 offensive line coach currently coaching. So we're taking Harry out of this. We're not comparing Harry, but I mean, you're talking about offensive line coaching royalty, Harry Hiestand and Bill Callahan. So I asked him if he ever met Joe Moore, and I guess Bill and Joe were pretty good friends, and Joe would wind up at Wisconsin's practices from time to time and get on Joe Rudolph and, critique him and as if he was his own player. And he said he really appreciated that. He was always straightforward, certainly not gentle. And then later on, right when Joe had gotten out of the NFL and he was helping out at his high school, Bell Vernon in Pennsylvania, this guy leans over the fence and is kind of barking at him from the fence. And it turned out to be Joe Moore when he was coaching in a game at Bell Vernon. So there was a neat connection there. Harry Hiestand was at the University of Cincinnati when Joe Rudolph and the offensive line coach there, when Joe Rudolph was a high school senior. He ends up at Wisconsin, but Harry tried to recruit him to Cincinnati, sat in his living room. Joe said that his mom made Harry a nice meal, and he's certainly familiar with the way Harry coaches and the standard he set at Notre Dame. So when you look at Moore, Hiestand, and Callahan, wow, that's a lot of coaching greatness touching this career. Now, Joe needs to go do it himself, and hopefully these influences have affected him. But the great part about it is there's a respect. He doesn't look at Harry and say, okay, yeah, we throw that out the window. He talked about wanting to make this a smooth transition and feels he can because of the standard that Harry set, and that there are a lot of similarities in terms of their old school, in terms of how they teach, and certainly technique driven.
Yeah, and he seemed to be really drawn to the program by the importance that Marcus Freeman has placed on offensive line play. He said something about, like, it's not really in fashion for head coaches to say that we want to be an O-line driven program and we want to embrace that. We want the O-line to sort of drive the bus. And that is what Marcus Freeman has repeatedly said since he's taken over as head coach at Notre Dame, and clearly expressed that to Joe Rudolph. And that was something that excited him about being here. I know you asked Joe Rudolph about his philosophy in terms of who do you decide gets on the field? Are you playing your best five? Are you position specific? What were your takeaways from what he told you there?
Right. So I think ideally he would like to be best five. You can't always, there's some guys that can't play tackle, obviously, but I think in this particular instance and in general, he wants his best five. So what does that mean for spring? That means the backup tackles are in play for those guard spots. That doesn't mean that they're going to win those, but they're going to have a chance to compete. So, Michael Carmody and Tosh Baker, if they fit inside. Now you might say, well, gosh, Tosh Baker, can he play inside? I mean, he'll get that opportunity to show it. Some people might say, well, why not kick Blake Fisher inside? I think that would not be a good solution there. But those guys will be in play, and I like that philosophy, putting your best five out there. If somebody hasn't played center before, like Nick Martin, no big deal. You teach him, and he becomes a second-round draft choice. So I like that part of it. In terms of developing players, as just following up on that, I'll give you a little taste of his philosophy. He sent a lot of players to the NFL, a lot of All-Americans, 9 All-Americans, 5 of them first team during his time at Wisconsin, which was 2015 to 2021. But this is what he says about player development. He says, I take a lot of pride in that because every person is different. You don't coach every guy the same. There are fundamentals you all adhere to, but you create an environment where you want these guys as a group to be great together. If they're committed to that, they're helping each other, they're raising the bar to be better in any and every area. As a group, they'll all be better because each individual is the best they can be.
Yeah, and I was there when he was talking about, someone asked him just about, hey, how proud are you of the NFL guys that you developed? And he's like, yes, I am proud of that. But he's also proud of being able to maximize guys who maybe aren't going to be in the NFL as well, but be able to get the most out of them, whether that is being a backup guard or if it's starting at guard for 3 years and still maybe not making the leap to the NFL level, but being a contributor at the college level and giving everything you have to the position and to your teammates. So I thought that was kind of neat. He spoke to the fact that being a coordinator helped him be a better offensive line coach. I think that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that I noticed just briefly was that he expressed an excitement about recruiting. Like that is something that he believes is important and is something that he likes to do. And certainly that is something we would expect to hear from any assistant coach hired by Marcus Freeman. So that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else about Joe Rudolph we didn't cover you think is worth mentioning?
A couple things. I mean, he, in the recruiting end of it, he understands that he's got to recruit nationally, but he also understands the fit part of Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned YND, the offensive line thing, but I mean, he was so impressed with Marcus Freeman, and also that there was a faith part. He didn't go into depth with it, but there's a faith thing that told him that this was really the time to be at Notre Dame, and so I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, I could have talked to him another hour. I guess I'm fascinated by offensive line, the position, because it's so interconnected with 5 people. And I just think this is a really interesting hire. And I felt really good about the hire. I mean, he was my number 1 choice going into it. And I feel even better about how this is going to play out. One last thing I'll mention is Sam Pendleton is the only offensive lineman that's on campus as an early enrollee this spring. And so we talked to him about and he was disappointed that Harry left. I mean, that was a big reason that he was attracted to Notre Dame. But he was also recruited by Virginia Tech, so he already knows Joe Rudolph, and he feels like the transition is going really well, and he likes it. But he had some opinions about it, and he's related. He's relating things to the other offensive linemen who are not yet on campus and kind of helping them keep up with the changes and so forth. Again, the goal is a smooth transition So I don't think you're going to see an overhaul in the way that Notre Dame is doing things with its offensive line.
Yeah, and Joe Rudolph will now be Notre Dame's third offensive line coach in 3 seasons, which can be a little bit of a concern. And I know you reached out recently to Braxton Cave, who had his own, I guess, unfair share of offensive line coaches
4 and 5 years
because he had so many O-line coaches. What did Braxton tell you about what's important to make sure that the guys and this can work, being with 3 offensive line coaches in 3 seasons?
Right. He said, every coach has their own little way of doing things. Sometimes terminology, sometimes just the way they teach, technique, certainly demeanor. I mean, Jeff Quinn, to either of these two guys, Harry or Joe Rudolph, is way on the different side in terms of demeanor that he brings to practice, also in terms of teaching technique. And you know what? I mean, you could argue that Jeff Quinn is as good or better at recruiting than those guys. I mean, Joe certainly has a chance to step up into that, given now the national landscape that he has to recruit instead of kind of Wisconsin and the surrounding states. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And I also asked him, I said, did you feel like you had to prove yourself over and over again to the new coach, saying, hey, I deserve to be the starter here?
Right.
And he said, you know what? You have to prove yourself every day at Notre Dame anyways, whether there's a new coach or not, because there's a lot of talent. If you're not playing well, they'll make a change. And we saw that certainly a couple of years ago when Joe Alt kind of rose to the top of the depth chart unexpectedly. I think he was the 3rd or 4th option at left tackle when they tried him there. And then Andrew Kristofic also took over for Zeke Correll, who had started the season at left guard. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, just a lot of different things. The positive that Braxton took from it was he tried to take the best of every coach that he learned from. And in his mind, Harry was at the top of the charts. In fact, Harry still will text him with game film, and critique him from games that are 11 years old. So Braxton's still getting coached, even though he's way away from football now. I suppose maybe he can, he's got a couple of sons and a daughter. Maybe he can use Harry's tips on those 3.
And then the other coach we talked to last night was quarterbacks coach Gino Guiduli, who had a brief stint at Wisconsin after his time at Cincinnati before coming to Notre Dame. What were your main takeaways from the conversation with him? I was there for for a very short amount of time because I was talking to Sam Hartman. But what were the biggest bullet points that you had from that conversation?
Yeah, Gino is. I don't think Gino is a coach that's super warm and snuggly. I mean, Gino is business, and he's kind of got a tough exterior, and yet I think he's super knowledgeable, really very self-aware about his own coaching strengths and the things that he still needs to learn. But right off the bat, getting Hartman up to speed, what was that process like? He expressed that Sam was a little disappointed because of all the coaching changes that he wasn't a little further along. So what they did was they looked at 3 or 4 games of Wake Forest tape that were from later in the season, and they went through everything. What were you thinking here? What did you see with the defense here? So that Gino could kind of get a sense of what makes Sam Hartman tick. What are his strengths? What's he seeing? What can Gino help him with? And then in terms of learning Notre Dame's current offense, they're learning together because this isn't an offense that Gino's particularly familiar with either. And so one of the interesting things to me about that was that Tyler Buckner and Steve Angeli are helping Sam Hartman get up to speed, that they're really helping teaching both those guys the offense. And then Gino has also reached out to Tommy Reese a couple times because he's had questions, and Tommy Reese has been more than happy to answer those questions. I've got some other things, but I'd let you jump in there.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's not surprising to hear that, but it's sort of the fact that Angeli and Buckner can help sort of indicates that there's not like these vast changes between Jared Parker's offense and Tommy Reese's offense. Notre Dame wants to sort of do a lot of the same things. They're going to figure out the best ways to communicate it, whether it's keeping the same lingo that the players are used to and Gino adapting, or Gino bringing in some new language that maybe Sam is familiar with, that makes more sense in certain situations. So I think there's an interesting melding of that all coming together. Gino did say that he believes that he inherited a pretty good quarterback room. I think that's a pretty fair statement. And I like what he said based on his early impression of Tyler Buckner, that Tyler Buckner is not going to take a backseat to anyone. Like, he's going to be fighting to try to beat out Sam Hartman, no matter how daunting of a task that may seem. So the other thing that I noticed was that he was asked about Desmond Ridder, certainly, although I think much later in his conversation than he probably expected, because someone asked, "Have you been asked about Desmond Ridder?" He's like, "No," and so he didn't take too much credit for him. But he was quick to he had like the bio information down pat. Like he was ready to tell us that Eastern Kentucky was the only other school to offer Desmond Ridder out of high school, and that he was the second quarterback taken in last year's NFL draft. When someone mentioned that he was a third-round pick, it's like, well, not just the third-round pick, he was also the second quarterback. So definitely take some pride in what they were able to do at Cincinnati, while obviously wanting and knowing that that's on his resume, but also not trying to take away from what Desmond Ridder did to get him in those positions as well.
Right. A couple things I'll add are he wasn't going to turn down the chance to work with Marcus. That was a huge selling point for him.
Mm-hmm.
He had, for those that are a little bit unfamiliar, he was the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach at Cincinnati last year with Luke Fickell. Then when Luke got the Wisconsin job, he went to Wisconsin with Luke and was on the job for only a few weeks when Marcus called. And so he hadn't moved his family yet to Wisconsin. So they said, let's take this job. And he's pretty fired up about it. He's got a history with Jared Parker too. And it all actually goes back to their playing days in Kentucky. They played a playoff game against each other. He didn't tell us who won the playoff game, but he asked us to ask Jared about it. So I think
he implied who won.
Yeah. And then at one point, Parker had been offered a head coaching job. We don't know at what level, and he was interested in having Gino on his staff. He ended up not taking that job, but the two had kind of discussed things. So the other thing is, I had to kind of ask him in a creative way, had he talked to CJ Carr, because you can't have him mention that. You can't mention him by name and him respond to a question like that, because it's against NCAA rules. So I said, there's recruits out there. Have you had a chance to talk to them? And, what was your message to them? And so it sounds like at least they've started to build that connection. And then, I was looking at CJ's 7-on-7 schedule, and if he plays in all those games all over the country that the California Power are playing, it doesn't seem realistic that he would be able to even get to Notre Dame in March. If it's going to happen, I think it's going to be April. And I would expect CJ to show up. I think he, needs to invest in getting to know Jared Parker better and getting to know Gino Guiduli besides a texting FaceTime relationship.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know there was maybe a little bit of pause for concern with CJ Carr taking some visits to Texas and Texas A&M with his 7-on-7 team this past weekend. A continuation of what happened when his team went up to the Seattle area and visited Washington. So we'll see how that continues. Notre Dame doesn't seem terribly concerned about it, but my view is always, you never know what happens when a kid steps foot on campus. He could sort of fall in love with it all of a sudden. I don't think CJ is seeking out these schools in any way, but he's in the area with his 7-on-7 team and giving him something to do. So it can be dangerous, but I don't think it's like with any sort of intent of trying to flip his commitment. That's not the sense that I've gotten so far.
Right. So, okay. So we'll get to Sam Hartman now. Tyler, you were over there for the whole time. I watched the videos and I've read the transcript. Really interesting interview.
Yeah, I was not only just there for the whole. So for those unfamiliar, the way Notre Dame sets it up, which is we are big fans of, is to separate the writers from the TV and camera online video folks. So there's basically two different sessions. One's a little bit more relaxed in that you're not on camera when you're discussing things, and then the other one you are on camera to discuss things. So I was upstairs for the first interview that he did with the writers, and then I just followed him downstairs to the camera crew section with the TV reporters and online reporters, and it was interesting to say a lot of the same things were said in both of them, and the TV one was shorter than I expected. The biggest reason I followed him down was that I wanted to ask him about NIL, which wasn't asked in the print, the writers portion, and didn't get a chance to get that one in the second time. So we'll have to hear from Sam Hartman about NIL in the future. But I think some of the things that stood out to me was that I thought it was interesting in that he made a couple of comments about how long it's been since he was making the decision to come to Notre Dame. So to me, it's reflective of probably a couple of things, how much he's sort of gone through, and maybe like seeming like it's been a long time where there was so much uncertainty there for a little bit. But it definitely seems like he's bought in and isn't thinking about that decision anymore, or like that he regrets anything. He's moved past that Tommy Rees left and cited what he said is one of his favorite sayings is "It is what it is," and so I think that's a bit of a motto of his. But he does seem to like Gino Guiduli and Jared Parker, and has been trying to work closely with them, get to know them better, be on the same page with those guys. In terms of what this represents for him, like Notre Dame as an opportunity, he spoke to sort of I guess you could call them cliche things about why people like Notre Dame, the history, the tradition, the national championships, the golden helmets, the touchdown Jesus, the golden dome, sort of the things that everyone associates with Notre Dame. But one thing that I found interesting, it wasn't necessarily, at least in the way he described it, it wasn't necessarily that he could just play in a more pro style offense at Notre Dame. It was beyond that, sort of the whole circumstance that he would be coming to a new team with very few connections, and that sort of being like a test run of what it will be like to join an NFL team. And that's part of why, maybe not specific to why he came to Notre Dame, but that sort of explains why it made sense for him to transfer to another school rather than return to Wake or even go into the NFL. He didn't necessarily like the feedback he had received about his NFL prospects, so he felt like he had something more to prove. And so he thinks that walking into a situation like this where he doesn't know these guys very well, this is a brand new team, he's going to have an opportunity to sort of show how he can adapt quickly rather than sort of being in this same offense at Wake Forest for 5 seasons. And of course, someone should be able to have success in those circumstances when he knows the playbook so well. And this will be a little bit of a different thing. So I think that that was a pretty important thing. And we got a question here from Adam Hugg about Sam Hartman. Is it just me, or did Hartman become more valuable now that he has already overcome adversity?
Well, I think that's part of the fabric of who he is, and what makes him great, because he's done it over and over again. I mean, personal tragedy, injuries, getting passed on the depth chart at one point, and fighting through all that, and fighting through it pretty diligently. He's been on a Netflix docuseries when he was in high school, and so he's somewhat used to the exposure, although certainly Notre Dame brings it to a whole nother level. So
Right.
I love that part of who he is. And I think that's a really good question, Adam.
What from what you heard or saw that Sam Hartman said stood out to you?
Well, I was surprised he was a communications journalism guy. That surprised me a little bit. He came off as kind of what I hoped he would be. I think the one thing that was an interesting thing is he's expected to lead and he's expected to follow, and he's trying to balance that right now. You can't just walk in and say, I'm Sam Hartman, get
Right.
behind me. He's got to earn that respect with the players that he's around, and he's learning. I mean, Tyler Buckner and Steve Angeli know the offense better than he does.
Right.
But the more I think about this, if Tyler Buckner is patient, I think this is going to be an incredibly great experience for Tyler Buckner to have spent a year with Sam Hartman. I think it's going to make him better on the other side. But yeah, there was it went too quick. Your guys' interview went too quickly, but it was fascinating. If you're a subscriber, you can read the entire transcript of the interview. Tyler did a really great feature today, which is free for those of you who are not subscribers and who have, are counting your pennies. You can read that story for free.
Yeah, and that's InsideNDSports.com, where you can get all of our stuff as always. A couple other things that stood out to me that Sam Hartman was asked about, sort of the interception totals, and was sort of given a branch to like sort of say, hey, was this just because you were asked to do so much scoring with Wake Forest's defense maybe not always being so good and the offense being demanded to throw the ball all the time? And he took the blame for that. He wasn't interested in saying, yeah, well, I threw all those interceptions because I was the only one that could do anything for us. That was not what he was an avenue that he was interested in going down, which isn't surprising, but it is nice to hear under that circumstance. I think he was very careful to not sort of downgrade anything that happened during his time at Wake Forest, how grateful he was for that opportunity. Because I think there is sort of some sense the way I discussed that he said about like starting over new is something that could be valuable from the NFL perspective. So separating himself from Wake Forest, I think there is some value to that, but he didn't want to like sort of co-sign that. He's like, no, I love my time at Wake Forest. Those guys took a chance on me, stuck with me for a very long time. He said it kind of sucks how it all played out. He's certainly well aware that they're on the schedule in November, and that's going to be pretty strange for him. He's like, hey, I know everyone on that team, even the guys that are freshmen that weren't there when I was there. I helped recruit them to come to Wake Forest. So there's it's gonna be an interesting moment for him come November. And the last thing I wanted to point out that he was sort of asked that if he likes to push the ball downfield, and he had a 3-word response. It was 10-2. Yeah. So that was a pretty good one in my opinion. It sort of speaks to his confidence in his ability and his awareness of what he's good at as well. All right, you spent most of your time in terms of the newcomers speaking with wide receiver Caleb Smith from Virginia Tech, who actually has a tie to Sam Hartman. Do you want to explain that connection to Sam Hartman before we talk more broadly about Caleb Smith?
Sure. So Caleb grew up in Virginia, and he was a 3-star safety prospect that Wake Forest was willing to recruit as a wide receiver. So Sam Hartman, also 3-star prospect, didn't have a lot of offers either. And those guys became friends through their recruitment at Wake Forest, and they actually both committed to Wake Forest initially. Chad Greer, who's Sam's high school coach, was a college teammate of James Smith, who's Caleb's father. And so they spent a lot of time on, junior days together, sidelines on the Wake Forest home games and so forth. They talked about how they were going to shock the college football world, being 3 stars. They both had chips on their shoulder. Late in the recruiting process, Caleb Smith decided he wanted to go Virginia Tech, be a little bit closer to home. And those guys stayed in touch this whole time, following each other's careers. They faced each other a couple times in ACC play. And so independently, they picked Notre Dame for their transfer portal destination. First Caleb, and then Sam Hartman. And so the day, I thought this was pretty cool. So the day that winter workout started in mid-January, they decided they were going to break in their cleats. So they went over to across the street to the Irish Athletics Center, and they threw the passes that they never got a chance to throw at Wake Forest. And Caleb Smith said he got goosebumps. And all of a sudden it felt like kind of destiny kind of thing going through his mind, that they're both playing the best football of their careers. Now they're on this bigger stage and they've reunited together. I thought it was just a really cool story, all the connections and how they never lost touch with each other.
Yeah, and an interesting connection also is that both he and Joe Rudolph were at Virginia Tech last year, and obviously the O-line coach, and the wide receiver, and one of the star wide receiver aren't working that closely together. But the fact that they both sort of made the leap to Notre Dame in the same offseason, but at different times, was kind of interesting as well.
Right, and Caleb had a scouting report on Joe Rudolph. He goes, and I can vouch for this. Absolutely not one of the nicest guys you'll ever want to meet away from football, away from the field. He said on the field, he goes, now let me tell you, he's the real deal. He gets after those guys. And he goes, and they must, it must be okay with them because they love him. And so so he had a scouting report on Joe.
What else stood out to you about Caleb Smith?
Just how mature he is, how willing to work for this dream he is. He doesn't feel like, I'm walking in here a sixth-year guy and I should be a starter over these freshmen and these other guys that have had some ups and downs. He wants to earn it. And he mentioned some quote from his dad about being uncomfortable is, that's how you grow, is being uncomfortable and stuff. But I mean, he said he set foot on Notre Dame. He wanted to commit right away. In fact, he committed on his visit before he left. But I think this guy could be a starter for them, certainly a rotational player, but he may be their best receiver because I think his best football is still ahead of him. 6'2", 222 pounds, was Virginia Tech's best receiver on a really bad offensive team this past year. But again, he's a guy that's always kind of looking for fuel. Right after he signed with Virginia Tech, they're like, oops, we don't have a scholarship for you. You're going to have to walk on. And so he did, and he got the scholarship later. He had a position coach who had just been let go at one point, and he told Caleb that he needed to go to a lower level if he wanted to be successful, that he wasn't good enough to play at the FBS. So that drove him. And I just like the way he processes adversity. Both of those guys, Adam Hugg asked the question about Sam Hartman's processing adversity. I love the way that's kind of paralleled with Caleb Smith. We also broached the subject of there being two Caleb Smiths on the team that play the same position. They have not met each other yet because Caleb the younger is the only wide receiver that's not an early enrollee. But Caleb the elder was saying, that when he was getting recruited by Notre Dame late in the cycle and signing that the Virginia Tech Caleb was getting tagged on all the social media stuff that was meant for the other Caleb. So, but he said, we don't have our jerseys on the back, and our names on the back of the jersey, so that's one good thing. And he said, and I hear he goes by KK, so I think we're going to be good.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. They got to be careful to not be in the same place at the same time too often. They got to make sure the time space continuum stays in the right balance. So, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about the NFL Combine. Before we did that, I was going to introduce this series of questions that were submitted to us by LDL Go Irish on the Insider Lounge. So I couldn't fit them all into like one comment here. So I will put them together. So if you bear with me, I'll read them to you. And if you need me to reread something, let me know. LDL Go Irish asked, at the Combine, Isaiah Foskey frankly said that if NIL money was available the way it is today, he would have probably made a different decision in the school he chose in 2019. Please openly discuss how this will affect recruiting at Notre Dame. If he feels this way, I am sure other athletes do also. Perhaps Foskey would have been the Keeley of 2019. Does Notre Dame need to modify how it approaches NIL to compete? Will ND do that? Consider that ND was opposed to the Rockney Fund at first And now Jack Swarbrick infers that fans should contribute to the Rockne Fund to help ND compete.
Okay, so let me touch on that end part, and then I'll go back to the beginning. I think there's two. There's Rockne Fund is, I think, what endows the coaching positions. It's not the fund, which is Friends of the University of Notre Dame, that is the NIL thing, right? Those aren't the same thing.
Those are definitely different, correct?
Okay. So I just wanted to correct the record there, but so let's go back to the original part of it. I thought that was a very interesting comment. The thing about it is we don't know where NIL is going. I think Notre Dame has to be aggressive in terms of publicizing the deals that its athletes have, because that's kind of the counterbalance. They're not going to pay the acquisition fees, but if they can show, hey, Kyle Hamilton got this deal, Michael Mayer got this deal, Isaiah Foskey got this deal, Sam Hartman has a bunch of them, then kids could say, okay, the money's not guaranteed, but I'm going to have a chance to earn it while I'm at Notre Dame, and I can make some pretty good money as well as playing college football. I think that's what Notre Dame is counting on, and I think that's the best they can do until the rules change. The other thing is we don't know how sour some of these deals are going to go at other places. Is the money being promised in the acquisition fees actually going to show up? We saw, what's Rashada's first name that ended up Jaden, that was going to go to Miami and ends up at Arizona State with Drew Pine. That money kind of evaporated. There was this big promise of $13 million, and then suddenly the deal wasn't going to come through, and he ends up playing somewhere else. So we're just going to have to see how that plays out. I don't think Notre Dame will ever, if you're hoping that they get into the acquisition fee game, I just don't think it's going to happen. And eventually I do think those will go away. But it's going to take somebody other than the NCAA to get this straightened out, because they had their chance and they blew it. Now, a lot of people like the new NCAA director, but I don't think he has the power to rein this in at this point. It's going to take Congress, and they seem to have other things on their mind right now.
Yeah. Let me clean up the Rockne Athletics Fund first. I'm not sure which one LDL Go Irish is referring to, if he's referring to fund, the NIL program that's not run by Notre Dame. It's run by Friends of the University of Notre Dame.
And Brady Quinn's very involved in that.
Brady Quinn,
Tom
Mendoza, correct. And I think the Rockne Athletics Fund was the fund that Jack Swarbrick linked to in his email in regards to the angry. So I think that's why you may have thought it's related to coaches, but it's not actually related to coaches. And here's what Notre Dame says the contributions go toward, and it's funding student athlete scholarships, providing robust nutritional stations and team room provisions for all student athletes, expanding injury prevention, recovery, and rehab resources, funding summer scholarships and study abroad opportunities, and improving team transportation. So the idea is that all that money goes towards student athletes specifically, not coaches.
There you go.
As it relates to Isaiah Foskey, what he said impacting recruiting, I don't see it impacting recruiting. Isaiah Foskey sort of denounced what was said. Whatever was said, it wasn't said at like the media scrum, because I was there for the entire thing. And so he must have said it in like a one-on-one interview or of some sort with I believe it's the San Francisco newspaper. And so I don't know what, I think Isaiah said it was out of context, which I think is what a lot of people say when they don't like how people react to what they're said. So I don't know what Isaiah said for sure or not, and how that was either misinterpreted or not. But I do think like this concept of Notre Dame isn't trying to pull guys in with NIL. It isn't new. Isaiah Foskey giving voice to that isn't necessarily new. I think he's just saying, I think, what many people were already aware of. But he's also, at least from the quotes that I saw, whether or not, and so like I can't speak to what what he meant by it, but I think there would be some honesty there. If NIL really mattered to you and like that was like the number one thing in your recruitment, that you probably wouldn't choose Notre Dame. And I think that's fine by Notre Dame too. They're not trying to recruit guys based on NIL. That's not the goal of the athletic program, the university. And so that is sort of the line that Notre Dame's trying to walk here. We'll see how well they can do that, because it does seem a bit risky if this has become such a driving force within college football. And we've seen all the arms races in terms of facilities, but if this becomes an NIL arms race, does Notre Dame get left behind if all these programs can really build up collectives that are fueling their programs and enticing recruits to come to campus, because there seems to be very little rules in place to prevent anything like that from happening, or consequences to that. So
right.
I think
I'll say, just to add, I don't talk to a lot of recruits, but I did 2 big stories on 2 of Notre Dame's better recruits or more highly rated, Christian Gray and Jaden Greathouse. Christian Gray couldn't care less about the NIL. In fact, the upfront stuff, he didn't want to have anything. That he really was bought into the whole picture of life after football, what Notre Dame can do for you. So he was looking down the road. Same to a certain extent with Jaden Greathouse. I got a sense that Jaden got more offers that, the Christian had stopped them before they could get to specifics. That Jaden was going to listen, but he just, again, felt like this was far down his priority list. So those offers are out there. There are certainly elite kids that are willing to come, and both of those guys are. I mean, they're both top 150 players. So there are kids that, not every kid, but certainly they're finding the kids that it's important, the picture that Marcus Freeman is selling.
I have a question here that was sent to us on Twitter that I just saw, so I'm going to include it here. And it's not related to anything we were just talking about. It's from Jeremy Lamb at Jeremy Lamb 19 on Twitter. On a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic about Notre Dame's football future were you when Brian Kelly left, and then when Marcus Freeman was hired, and then today?
Okay.
Let's break that. Let's each talk about when Brian Kelly left. How optimistic were we about ND's football future when Brian Kelly left? 1 to 10.
Okay. Before he left, or am I doing? Had Brian Kelly continued
when he
on?
left? No, just I'm interpreting it as like life without Brian Kelly, but not knowing who the next person would be.
Okay. Well, I thought Brian Kelly put it in a pretty good position for whoever was going to take it over.
Right.
That there was a lot of things built. You were missing some pieces, but you weren't missing infrastructure. You weren't missing pillars and a foundation and success, recent success. I mean, you didn't have to say, well, you know what? Back way before you were born, Notre Dame played and won a national championship. You could say, hey, we're in the playoff couple of years, in a 3-year period, very recent, when you were still, able to do, function in life. You were a boy, you weren't in diapers. So that was in place. So I felt if they could get the right coach, that they might actually be even better than where Brian Kelly was. I thought Brian Kelly at the end, the hope for Brian Kelly was that Marcus Freeman would stay more than a couple years, which was probably unrealistic, and that he could really upgrade their recruiting.
Right. So if you put that on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of optimism, what would be the number you would assign to that?
I would say in terms of eventually winning a national championship or just being really good.
That was not clarified. So I would say winning a national championship, because I think that's the only thing that matters to many Notre Dame fans.
I would say a national championship 8 eventually, that they would eventually get there.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was the number I had in mind as well, was 8, that Notre Dame was what Brian Kelly was leaving behind.
I don't play the games right sometimes. I just do the essay question instead of the multiple choice.
Well, that's why I'm here, to make sure that you fill in the right bubbles. And then what would be your score on 1 to 10 when Freeman was hired?
I put that as a 7. And the reason I do that is because the inexperience factor
Yeah.
and just the history of it. But I also thought, I thought there was great risk and great reward. So that it was,
Right.
I thought that Marcus had a chance to take them to higher heights. But again, he's walking into this NIL, and transfer portal thing where Notre Dame isn't favored in either of those. But I thought he's an elite recruiter. Can he overcome those? And so that was my thought, that Notre Dame had gotten as far as they could with really the talent base they had. They could get to the playoff. They couldn't win games there.
Yeah, I was at a 7 as well. I think the ceiling and the floor were both like, it's like, well, this could go terribly wrong, or this could be Marcus Freeman could take Notre Dame to new heights. So I just, the inexperience was too much for me to say, okay, this is like just carrying on what Brian Kelly left, and that this is for sure going to work.
And the funny thing is, he didn't necessarily carry
right.
on.
Yeah, he wanted, and it seemed like Jack Swarbrick's sort of justification for doing it was that he wanted to continue it on, and Marcus Freeman's like, that's not. But I don't know how much of that changed, like based on how things went at the start of the last season. So I don't know how much of that is like revisionist history, from my perspective. But and then what's your optimistic scale score for where Notre Dame football exists today?
I would say 8.3. I think it's a little higher than when Brian left. And why I say that is the unknown of the NIL transfer portal thing. I think Notre Dame at some point, I think they can get really good grad transfers. I think they're going to have to find some middle ground to be able to get other transfers. I think there's just going to be situations where there's really good players out there that want to come to Notre Dame, and they have to be allowed to do that. Notre Dame's not going to build their team based on transfers like USC did last year and some other teams, but they need to supplement that. You can fill holes now. There's no reason to go into a season and say, well, we're young at cornerback. That's not going to fly. Where I'm really optimistic is they have recruited the best player. I'm not on our rivals ratings, but maybe the best player in the transfer portal this year, and Sam Hartman at quarterback, at a position Notre Dame really needs. And as long as CJ Carr is coming and they get somebody in 2025, they're starting to get that talent at quarterback they need to win a playoff game. They're starting to get the wide receiver talent they need to win a playoff game. Those are where they really got beat up in the playoffs, is at those two positions in 2020 and 2018. That's where it really showed up.
Yeah, in terms of my score, I think I would just stay at a 7. And if I were trending towards a 6 or an 8, I would probably say a 6. I don't love how the coaching cycle has played out for Notre Dame. It's hard for me to say like Jared Parker is an upgrade over Tommy Rees, or an upgrade over some of the other options that they were interested in. Now that doesn't mean that they can't get back there, but I think that's why I'm keeping it at a 7. I'm just not. I haven't been swayed one way or the other that this is going to be better or worse than it was for Notre Dame last season. And the NIL stuff I think is worrisome. How much is that going to impact Notre Dame? Can it hold this stance that it is insisting on taking in the NIL place? The transfer situation the same. Like, is this in the long run going to hurt Notre Dame? Its inability to bring in undergraduate transfers. So I'm not ready to move the scale up higher yet in terms of what has transpired over the last 15 months for Notre Dame.
Well, I think some of the Marcus Freeman's hires have been way better than some of Brian Kelly's. Marcus Freeman is one of the best, if not the best hire of the Brian Kelly era. But you look at Charlie Molnar and Brian Van Gorder, Kerry Cooks. I mean, some of those guys are okay, but I mean, you look at the Brian Kelly coaching tree, it doesn't have a lot of fruit on there. It's got brown leaves. I mean,
yeah, but you can say, like, isn't Marcus Freeman following the same blueprint by bringing in guys and promoting guys that he's familiar with? I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think you could point to that and have that question of, like, why is this?
Well, I mean, I think that whole familiarity thing is overrated. I'm just saying he's picking guys he knows that are really good instead of guys he knows that are not particularly good. I mean, Charlie Molnar never should have been offensive coordinator at Notre Dame. I mean, Chuck Martin was good. Chuck Martin did a good job. But you're at Notre Dame, you need elite recruiters and elite coaches. And that's why the NFL's like, boy, we like Chancey Stuckey. We like Delon McCullough. We like Chris O'Leary.
Right.
Looking at Al Golden. And then Notre Dame has to, try to keep those guys. So far, we know that Stuckey, McCullough, and O'Leary are all going to stay. I mean, I still think there's a remote chance Al Golden could get swept away right before spring practice, but I think that's super, super remote.
Yeah, I guess I would push back on the I think the phrase you used was like Marcus Freeman knows these guys are really good. I don't think you can know that Jared Parker is a good offensive coordinator just because I don't think he has the resume to say that. Now I think Marcus Freeman believes that, but right. I don't know that you can say that and we said, hey, this could be the biggest hire of Marcus Freeman's tenure, and he made a hire that I don't know that a lot of people would be running to the hills to scream out, hey, we got Jared Parker. So that doesn't mean that Jared Parker can't be successful, but I think that's the hesitation that I have that I'm not willing to sort of.
Right. I think you also have to look at the Parker hire especially connected to Gino Guiduli, because Gino's got coordinator experience. Those guys have chemistry, apparently, despite their playoff loss by Gino. And you got a guy that's specializing on just coaching the quarterbacks. And a lot of Notre Dame fans have been calling for that. We'll see how well that works out. But I think Gino is as key hiring as Jared is. So, I mean, they go hand in hand. And then to have Joe Rudolph, an offensive line coach who's been offensive coordinator before for a lot of years, not necessarily a dynamic offensive coordinator, but a guy that certainly can talk X's and O's in a meeting room and help that offensive get better. But I agree. I mean, Parker is a risk. There's risk to that. But I think you look at the hirings that he's made, Marcus has since he took over, there's some pretty good prospects in there. I mean, Chancey Stuckey, wow, what a recruiting revelation for a guy that really had very little coaching experience. Now, again, we'll see. Right. This is going to be a year for Chancey to kind of show off his coaching chops. Let's see how he develops people this year.
For sure. All right. Well, we had some questions there that took up some good chunks of time and were very good questions. So thanks for submitting them, even though they weren't submitted through YouTube. We sourced them through our message board, the Insider Lounge, or Twitter. But I think we'll wrap things up with how things have gone today. We left some more meat on the bone, but that means there's more information for you that you can get on InsideNDSports.com or the Insider Lounge message board. We plan to be back next week with another Football Never Sleeps with a night to be determined. So we'll keep you in the loop on that. Like Eric mentioned at the top of the show, make sure you are subscribed and are signed up for notifications so you can be alerted that you will of when our next show will be, and also get some of the video content that we'll have from the interviews that we had with Notre Dame's players and new assistant coaches earlier this week. Notre Dame will be on spring break next week, but we won't be. So we'll be coming your way with another Football Never Sleeps and hopefully another podcast as well. But until then, stay tuned to InsideNDSports.com and the Insider Lounge message board.